Hi, and welcome back to the Drama Free Healthy Living podcast. I'm your host, Jess Cording, and I'm really excited to share today's episode with you. I am chatting with Dr. Jamil Zaki, who is a professor of psychology at Stanford University and the director of the Stanford Social Neuroscience Lab. He trained at Columbia and Harvard studying empathy and kindness in the human brain and on helping people learn how we can connect better. He's the author of the new book, Hope for Cynics, which I really hope you'll check out. It is an amazing resource, and I am really excited about this topic. In this episode, we talk about all different sides of this. We talk a lot about what drives cynicism. We talk about the difference between cynicism and skepticism. We go into things like, how this can impact our life. Like if somebody has a tendency towards cynical thinking, how that might have a negative impact on our life, about the role of the media. We talk about what tribal cynicism is. We talk about all different misconceptions about cynicism and skepticism. But ultimately, Dr. Zaki shares some really interesting insights on the importance of hopeful skepticism. And he explains all of what that is and how it can inspire positive change. And I got a lot out of this conversation. I really think that you will as well. So if you are listening to this, take a screenshot, post it on Instagram and tag me. I'm at Jess Cording. You can tag Dr. Zaki. I would love to hear what you think. You can find all that info in the show notes and definitely check out the book. All right. So without further ado, let's get to the episode. Welcome to Drama Free Healthy Living with Jess Cording. I'm your host, Jess Cording. I'm a registered dietitian, health coach, and author, and I'm here to help you streamline your wellness routine and establish a sane, more balanced relationship with food and fitness so you can reach your goals without losing your mind. On this podcast, we'll talk about nutrition, exercise, self-care, mindset, and more. I'll be bringing you interviews and expert insight on the topics that matter to your health and wellness. Jamil, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I was really looking forward to our conversation because I think I love the topic of your book and I really got a lot out of this. And I would love to hear a little bit just, your background. You're a professor of psychology at Stanford and you're the author of a book on cynicism and we'll talk all about the differences between cynicism and skepticism. But I'd love to know what inspired you to do the work that you do today?
Well, it's a great question, and I'll try to answer as briefly as I can. My parents are immigrants from really different places. My father comes from Pakistan and my mother from Peru. And they, I think, connected because they both felt foreign in the US and I think fell in love through that shared sense of being able to comfort one another in a place that they were unfamiliar with. But as they became more familiar with the US, they've been here for more than 50 years now, they realized how little they had in common, which as their only child, I can tell you, is very little, like almost nothing. And so a lot of my childhood was kind of wrapped up in their long and relatively unfriendly divorce. And that sounds like a really sad story, and in some ways it was. But it also was a sort of crucible in which I suppose for me, a lot of my personality was forged. In particular, I knew and still know that both my mom and dad are wonderful people, but they just didn't see eye to eye on almost anything. And as their only child, I had to sort of bridge their worlds and their realities and find ways to connect with each of them, even when they couldn't connect with one another. And I think that spurred in me a deep interest in how people connect, and in particular, how they connect across difference. And I didn't know the word empathy at the time or the word altruism, but all through my life, I was just really interested in those types of human connections. And I also happened to be a huge nerd and became really interested in neuroscience in high school. And in college and afterwards, realized I could put those interests together and actually study the science of human connection. So that's what I've done ever since. I've tried to understand how people can form deep ties with one another, what those connections do for us. And over the last 10 years, I've focused on how anyone can learn to connect more effectively. And so I guess it's taking my childhood experiences and trying to formalize them through the lens of behavioral science.
I love that. And I can relate to that a lot. A lot of what led me to study nutrition and wellness was just observing my own family members' health struggles when I was young and just seeing how that affected my own relationship with, health and my body. And, it was, and I think that there's a lot to be said for the experiences that we have early in life that really inform our experience and what we decide to, not to get too woo into like, healing generational stuff, but there's a lot there. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing as well. I think that in psychology we have a saying that research is me search. And nobody wants to be caught doing me search because it seems a little bit navel gazy, but it really is true. And I think that so many people who study psychology, and it sounds like nutrition as well, we're really trying to understand ourselves and our own experiences in new ways. And so I've more recently tried to own the me search idea and just admit to it. And I think that's the truth.
I love it. When I early in my career, I shied away from sharing my own experience, but then I realized that over time, and it's tricky because right, there's the whole self-disclosure aspect and, that piece of things, but I found that it actually was helpful for people I was working with to understand where I was coming from. And I thought in the book you did a really great job actually of showing us why this stuff is so important and how it's important to you. I think it really adds a really just great layer of meaning. And I really loved what you say about hopeful skepticism. Like I found myself kind of nodding along at certain points as you were talking about like early ideas of cynicism and like, that was sort of something that a lot of us were taught to think was like smart or what we should what we should be. But I would love if you could just briefly tell our listeners just about hopeful skepticism and just just what this is. It might be a new phrase for a lot of us.
Hopeful skepticism is a mindset that I endeavor to live with, and I think would be very healthy for many of us to live with. That doesn't mean it's easy. So we can talk all about the difficulties with that and the traps that our mind sets for us in a moment. But hopeful skepticism to me is an aspirational approach to living. It has two parts. One is skepticism, which is a scientific approach to thinking and believing things. In other words, not feeling like we want to jump to conclusions or make assumptions about people or about the world, but being more data driven, asking what is the evidence that I have to believe what I believe, and being restless and curious and open to new information. That's the skepticism part. The hopeful part is, I suppose, being ready to witness positivity in the world and in the people around us. And again, we can talk more about why that's aspirational, but I think oftentimes our minds trick us into focusing on the most negative information we can, whether it's in the news or in our workplaces or in the people around us. And the hopeful part of hopeful skepticism is understanding those biases and trying to counteract them. So, to kind of put it all together, I suppose hopeful skepticism is an open minded approach to the world that also includes an understanding that there is much more goodness in the world than most of us often realize.
I love that. There's so much I could say to that. Like someone listening to this and looking at, thinking about, okay, so, questioning and, looking at data and, looking for evidence. How might that differ from cynicism?
Great question. And I think this is really important because many people, let me be honest, myself included, before I started researching for this book, thought of cynicism and skepticism in the same way, as interchangeable with one another. But really, they're quite different. As I've just explained, skepticism is this data driven, scientific form of thinking. Cynicism is really different. It's a theory about people and humanity. It's the idea that people in general are selfish, greedy, and dishonest. And if you're a cynic, you believe those things more than you want evidence about people. So, in fact, many cynics, research shows, don't just feel these bleak things about people, they look for evidence to support their beliefs and dismiss evidence that doesn't support their beliefs. So, for instance, a cynic will be really quick to point out something selfish or untrustworthy that somebody else does. They'll remember betrayals and slights for years. But if somebody does something kind, they'll explain it away. They'll say, oh, they have ulterior motives. You can think of it as if a skeptic treats the world like a scientist might, a cynic treats the world like a lawyer might, and in particular, a lawyer who's working for the prosecution in the trial against humanity, right? They're looking for evidence that people are bad and ignoring evidence about human goodness.
That's such a great way to illustrate that, and I think, I'm just laughing thinking of, like, lawyers I know in real life, so it's so accurate. And so I was really something I found myself reflecting on as I was reading this is, I'm an '80s baby, so I grew up, like, watching Seinfeld and, like, all those, like, '90s sitcoms, and I feel like a lot of I also just, like, kind of what, the types of, like, media and stuff that was around, art, and a lot of it kind of was looking through that cynical lens, and I wanted to ask you, and you do talk about this in the book, but that cynicism is, it seems smart, but it isn't. And I would love for you to share with our listeners a little bit about what that means.
Yeah. Well, first of all, 80s kids unite. I'm right there with you. I sounds like we watched a lot of the same shows growing up. Yes, cynicism, it's interesting because it hurts us in a lot of different ways. It hurts our health, our relationships, our communities. I would even say our democracy, and we can get into more of why that is later if you like, but people still sign up for it. People are more cynical now than they were 10 or 20 years ago, or when Seinfeld was on as well. I think part of the reason is because our culture is not only cynical, it's cynicism positive, meaning that we glamorize cynicism and cynics in a number of ways. One of those is that we treat cynicism as though it's wisdom. There's this stereotype in our culture that people who are happy and optimistic and trusting are naive and gullible. They're rubes, they're chumps, they're marks, they're just getting ready to be taken advantage of at any moment. And that as you circle life's block enough times, you end up learning to be less trusting. And in fact, there's a stereotype that the less trusting you are, the wiser you are. So researchers, for instance, asked hundreds of people, who would you want to do different tasks? Who do you think would be better at a math task, a cynic or a non-cynic, for instance? And the majority of people think cynics will be better than non-cynics at analytical reasoning, basically that they're smarter. The vast majority of people also think that cynics are socially smarter, that they'll be able, for instance, to detect when somebody is lying. That's what researchers call the cynical genius illusion. And it's an illusion because most people are wrong. In fact, research shows that cynics perform less well than non cynics on cognitive tests. So they're not more clever, and they're worse at detecting liars than more trusting individuals. So this stereotype isn't just wrong, it's the exact opposite of right. We in essence think that cynicism is a sign of wisdom when it's actually the opposite. As I mentioned earlier, cynics think like lawyers. That might be a good way to argue if you want to argue against people, but it's a terrible way to learn about the world. And we see cynics paying a cost not only in terms of their health and well being, but also in terms of their acuity, their ability to understand the world around them and to understand other people.
That was actually something I wanted to ask you about because, we don't exist, in isolation, right? We exist like in an ecosystem of, other humans and animals and organizations. And, so a line that really resonated with me was you shared that when trust is depressed, cynicism rises. And, I've been in my field, for well over a decade and just listening to the way that people talk about, their lives and the world. And, I notice changes in how people have been, talking that. So that really resonated with me. But, if someone is experiencing that, what are some ways that that might show up in their behavior or, more broadly, in the community?
People probably listening to this right now are experiencing that because most of us are. It's incredible how much cynicism has increased over the last half century. In 1972, about half of Americans agreed that most people can be trusted. By 2018, that had dropped to a third. So that's a decline that matches in magnitude the amount that the stock market fell during the 2008 financial collapse, right? So it's basically a crash in trust, a massive deficit, and there's been no recovery. And it's not just America either. In a 2022 survey, people in 24 out of 27 countries said that their default was to not trust others. If you are experiencing that, it might show up in a bunch of different ways. You might feel less safe around strangers. You might feel more suspicious about the people in your life. You might have a default to think that people are trying to take advantage of you. I want to say it's really understandable if people feel that way. I don't want to blame anybody who is feeling cynical. I feel cynical all the time myself. In fact, this book began as an exploration of why I was feeling so cynical and what I could do about it. And I discovered how prevalent this feeling is. So we can talk about the reasons why cynicism is on the rise, but I guess I just want to make sure that your listeners feel normalized in that experience because it really, unfortunately, has become the norm in our culture, the way that most people feel most of the time.
And thank you for saying that, because I think to your point, there's a lot to be driving those feelings. And I think that, as humans, like we're just trying to cope and get through it. And I can see, I definitely, and I can relate to kind of having a tendency towards cynicism. It's just, I think it's very, very common. And yeah, I mean, I live in the Northeast too. So like there's that. But I appreciate you saying that. I think sometimes when we hear people, talking about like different research on health and wellness and mental wellness and mindset, there's this expectation that like somehow like this person has never struggled with that thing or that it's not, anything that's ever been an issue for them. But in reality, as we were talking about earlier, like a lot of us like find our way to the work that we do because we needed it at some point or
Yes.
that we still need it.
Yes.
Now, what about in like a work setting? Like, how might that, if someone has more of that cynical mindset, attitude, tendency, like, how might that show up?
A bunch of different ways, none of which are particularly helpful, I'm afraid. So cynicism hurts individuals in their careers. There was a giant study published a few years ago that examined people's cynicism and then the growth in their income over the following 8 to 10 years. And what those scientists found is that non cynics income increased steadily over a decade span in their careers, but cynics had a much lower increase in their income over that time. Now, why is that? Well, there's other research that points to potential reasons. So, cynics tend to have ambitions at work of succeeding by dominating others. In a workplace setting, if you think everybody is out only for themselves, well, then the only way you can succeed is by defeating others. You can think of cynics as believing that their workplace is a Darwinian sort of battle royale where all outcomes are zero sum and everybody needs to fight one another. That, of course, is how some workplaces work, but those workplaces don't work very well. So when you treat your organization in that way, you actually tend to not succeed even though you want to, because in most workplaces, thankfully, people succeed by cooperating. Cynics lose out on that. They lose out on what I would call a cooperative advantage. That's true for individuals in organizations, but it gets worse when you think about leaders who are cynical, because leaders who are cynical actually create conditions in which their employees are encouraged to compete and fight one another. So, for instance, those leaders might act in ways that are really untrusting towards their workers. In the book, write about all these dystopic spyware programs that companies downloaded onto their employees' computers during COVID, right? When people were all working remotely. Instead of trusting their employees to do their work in their own time, a lot of leaders, you know, forced them to stay on camera all day to make sure they were chained to their desk, or it made sure that their mouses were moving or tracked their keystrokes. That type of behavior sends a huge message to people in an organization that we don't trust you. We think that you're only out for yourself. Other leaders will do things like employee stack ranking, where employees are forced to be compared to one another, and only some are allowed to rise to the top, and people who are lower performing on a team risk layoffs. Those settings create cynicism not just for leaders themselves, but cynicism that reverberates across the organization, which is terrible for mental health in the workplace, morale. But here's the secret: it's also terrible for things like efficiency, productivity, and the bottom line. So, a long answer to a short question, but the punchline is that really cynicism hurts individuals in workplaces. And when leaders are cynical, it hurts the entire culture around them.
Oh my gosh, cheers to that. It's, I like having worked in a number of different organizations over the years and just had different exposure to, or having even when I was just doing corporate wellness in different types of organizations and hearing what the people I was caring for in those settings were, it teaches you a lot and just, oh boy. And thank you for sharing that. I wanted to ask you about as well the media. Like, what role does the media play in cynicism?
A huge role, and unfortunately, the media, not all media, of course, not this podcast, for instance, but but a lot of media has turned into a kind of cynicism factory. And I want to again really validate cynics here. I'm not on a one man crusade against cynics. I think that cynics are often coming from a really good place and want to be safe and want to build a better world. But and that's also true of journalists. I talked with a journalist named David Bornstein who had worked for the New York Times for a long time, and he put it so beautifully. He said that to people in his line of work, the best way to help the world is to point out where it's failing. And that includes really important journalistic work like exposés about corruption and abuse and all sorts of other harmful things that people in power are doing. It's incredibly important to report on and expose the horrible things that are happening in our world. I am not saying that media should focus only on rainbows and flowers and picnics, right? But I also think that in trying to point out harm and corruption, media and media companies in particular can often end up giving us a really skewed picture of what humanity is like by only reporting on the worst things that people do. There's a name for this in communications science. It's called mean world syndrome. So it turns out that the more that people watch television and the more that they consume news online, the worse that they think the world is, and often the more wrong they are about it. I'll give you one example. So, over the last 30 or so years, Gallup has asked Americans 27 times, do you think violent crime in the US, has increased, decreased, or stayed the same? And in 25 of 27 of those surveys, most Americans thought violent crime was increasing. And the more news you watch, the more you think that's true. But over that same 30-year span, FBI statistics show that violent crime in the US decreased by 50%. So here you have, again, not just people being wrong, but people being the exact opposite of right. Another example of this: I surveyed 1,000 Americans and asked them, do you think that during the COVID pandemic, people around the world became kinder, less kind, or did kindness stay the same? The vast majority thought that kindness had decreased during the pandemic, and the more news you watched, the more you thought that. But in fact, data show that people volunteered more, donated to charity more, and helped strangers much more during the pandemic than they had in the years before. So, in essence, media companies, in many cases, trying to really do a service by showing us harm and exposing it and holding power to account. But what they end up doing is giving us this very unfun, funhouse mirror version of our world where we are hyper focused on the worst things that people are doing and miss out on so much human goodness around us.
I'm kind of laughing to myself because as you're saying this, I'm like, "Oh, well, they're just trying to get ratings and clicks." So, of course, I'm like but that's actually a really interesting I never really have thought of it that way in terms of, trying to help by showing what's wrong. That's a really interesting insight. I really like that. But
I
yes,
mean,
I
it also is an attempt to get clicks, and sadly, it's a successful attempt to get clicks. There was a study of online news sources that found that for every negative word in a headline, that story got 2% more clicks. So there's both a moral version of this where journalists are trying their best to expose harm so that they it can stop and end up skewing us, and then there's a more, well, I guess, cynical version of it where they're just trying to get clicks, and probably both are ingredients in this recipe.
Yeah, well, that's yeah, exactly. I feel like it probably also exists on a spectrum, depending on the publication and the outlet and the type of outlet, their audience, all that stuff. And I know from just having been on the writing side of it, there have been times when, I write an article and, I was trained to like evidence-based, recommendations and, patient-centered care. Like, I'm not someone who is inclined to do like sensational headlines. I've struggled with headlines a lot. But then I'll see like editorial has changed it to be like, "Don't eat these foods if you want to live," or like, yeah, I don't know, like something like that. And it's just, oh man, it's hard.
100%. And, I think that so we're talking about journalists and news creators here, but let's go back to cynics themselves. And again, I just want to say how much I understand if you feel if your listeners feel this way, because most people are exhausted by the news.
Yeah.
If you ask people to complete the sentence, the news makes me feel blank, you get a lot of bad language after that. I mean, people feel completely inundated with bad news all the time, and yet we can't turn away. We feel as though it's our responsibility somehow to stay informed. But I think it's important to remember that the news is really only informing us about half of life, and and that we're being informed about the worst half. And so if we then feel really bad about people and about the world, that's really understandable. But we might want to challenge our assumptions and realize that the information we're getting is skewed in this way.
I wanted to take a little detour, and you have some great terms in this book, by the way. One of my favorites was social shark attacks. And I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about what that is and how to spot that.
Yeah, social shark attacks is a term that I came up with for my own life because even though I do a lot of speaking and teaching and I'm sort of I kind of talk for a living. I'm actually quite introverted, and can be pretty anxious in social situations. And what I found myself experiencing is that I felt really nervous and avoidant when I had to go to it's like going to a party or even hang out with a friend who I know I get along with and really like. Before those times together, I'd sort of play in my mind all the things that could go wrong. Like, oh, this is gonna be awkward. What if I say something stupid? What if nobody laughs at my jokes? Sort of like this I guess I'm anticipating the worst possible outcome for a social situation, and then I actually go to spend time with people, and it's much better than I was fearing. And I guess I started thinking about this as social shark attacks because shark attacks are also something that people are really scared of, but are really rare, right? So people, you can look this up, but people fear sharks way more than they really should. Like they put sharks as really high up on the things that they worry about. But the likelihood of a shark biting you is basically zero. And I think that we also, I don't think I'm alone in my anxiety about social situations. And it turns out that, in fact, lots of people, if you ask them to imagine what a conversation with a stranger will be like, or what it would be like if they disclosed something that they're struggling with to a friend, or express gratitude or a compliment, people will think up, right? They'll conjure up the worst versions of that. And they think all the time about these awkward moments that they could have. But then if you ask them to actually have these conversations, they tend to love them. So I think of social shark attacks as these events that we worry about that actually are quite rare, right? In this case, awkward conversations and terrible social interactions. But because we're so worried about them, we avoid real interactions and deprive ourselves of the joy and psychological nourishment we would get from those interactions because we're fearing the worst.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I thought that was such a great thing that I think was really relatable. I know I certainly can relate to that, and just from the conversations I always have with like my clients and just like people in my life, a lot of us struggle with that. And you know, for for somebody who is maybe they recognize that this is a factor for them. Like, would you recommend that they just like acknowledge it and be like, actually, shark attacks don't happen that often. Like, how bad could it really? It actually could be really good. Like, anything that you would recommend?
Yeah, I think there's and this also would be my recipe in general for replacing cynicism with hopeful skepticism. But I think that there's two main steps. One is to think differently, and the other is to act differently. So, how would you think differently to avoid social shark attacks? Well, I might, and this is what I do myself, for just to be clear, because I struggle with this too, is to challenge my cynical assumptions. Okay, let's say that I'm going to a party and I say, man, this is going to be so awkward. People are going to be rude or they're not going to want to talk to me. Well, then I might ask myself, what evidence do you have for that? Think about the last five parties that you've been to. Were people rude? Inevitably, the answer is no, they were delightful. Did you have any good conversations? The answer is always yes, I did. Right. And then say, okay, well, why then are you feeling like things will go terribly this time? What evidence do you have for it? So sort of fact checking cynical feelings, especially when, when they're sort of getting out of hand is a starting point. And then the second is to act differently. And here I would just say, jump into the social water, test the social waters. And bonus points if you want to compare your expectations to the data, right? So again, if we're thinking and acting like scientists, what you might do is say, okay, I feel apprehensive about going to this party. I'm going to write down how I think my average conversation will feel on a scale of one, it's the worst conversation, worst experience I've ever had in my social life, to 10, absolutely delightful. And I'm going to write down what I think the average conversation will feel like for me. Then go, try it out, and keep a note for yourself. How enjoyable was the average conversation? If you're like most people, you're going to be surprised, pleasantly surprised, because most people underestimate how positive social interactions will be. So, taking those two steps, challenging your assumptions, and then testing them can be a good way to revise our cynical mindset. And in this case, overcome social shark attacks.
Love that. I also another term that I really like that you share in the book is tribal cynicism, and I would love for you to share with us a little bit about what that looks like.
Well, I think that we've been talking about cynicism in general, the idea that people are greedy, selfish, and dishonest. Tribal cynicism is the idea that people who are unlike me in some way, if we're in an us and them world, then people who are thems are especially greedy, selfish, dishonest, or in many cases, stupid or evil, right? And in the US and beyond, this type of cynicism has been accelerating. And I want to be really clear, there are real and concrete disagreements and differences in values that Americans have, that people around the world have. So I'm not trying to paper over real differences and real conflict that we need to address ideologically and politically. But it's also true that people in the US are dead wrong about who is on the other side. So we don't know what the people we disagree with are like demographically. For instance, Democrats think that 45% of Republicans make more than $250,000 a year when the actual percentage is two, right? So we don't know who's on the other side. We think that people we disagree with are way more extreme than they really are politically. We think that they're much more hateful than they are. And we think even that they're more violent than they really are. So tribal cynicism is, in essence, not the real disagreements that we have, but the distortion of those disagreements into a caricature of the other side that is almost less than human. And that gets in the way of our ability to even start addressing our real differences. Because not only do we disagree about what we disagree about because we don't know what the other side feels or thinks or what they want.
Is that another area where you would tell someone, like, to just acknowledge the thoughts that they're having, the bias they're having, and then again to challenge that? Is that something that you would recommend someone start with?
Absolutely. There's lots of evidence that you can look up that's less biased than what most of us probably see. I mean, one issue is that many of us are fed media that it really explicitly encourages us to see the other side in the worst terms possible. Researchers have a name for this, nut picking. It's when people select a very extreme example of what the other is like and then share that as this is what the average person on the other side is like. So it would be like, taking a really extreme person at a political rally, interviewing them, catching them saying something extremely offensive, and then saying, see, this is what the average person on the other side is like. When we are asked to think about the average person we disagree with, we tend to think about that extreme person. If you want to stop doing that, the best thing to do is try to find an actual person you disagree with and have a real conversation. I know that sounds so unpalatable to many people. And in my lab, we've done this. We had over 100 Democrats and Republicans have Zoom conversations about political issues they disagreed with. And we asked them, what do you think this conversation will be like? And they thought the conversations would be terrible. We paid them, so they had them anyways. And then afterwards, we asked them on a 1 to 100 scale, where one is really awful and 100 is really wonderful. How was that conversation? And the most common response we got was 100. People loved connecting with somebody on the other side. Why? Because they were shocked that this person was reasonable and values oriented. We have no idea how similar we are because, again, we're conjuring up the most extreme version of the other side. So when you actually have people get together, they again are pleasantly surprised by what they have in common. Now, I don't know how we can encourage those conversations to spread because there's so much inertia against them. But I think it's important to realize that, again, not trying to dismiss the real disagreements we all have, but that the disagreements that we think we have are much greater and much more toxic, and that if we actually took time to understand or connect with real human beings, we might be shocked at how much there is that we actually can connect over.
I think that that's very timely that we're having this conversation as we're gearing up for election season. So I'm really glad that you brought that up because yeah, it's going to be a ride. So wise words. Thank you. I know you touched on this a little bit previously, but the difference between hope and optimism, I love this. And I would really love if you could share with our listeners a little bit about how these are different from each other.
Thank you for the opportunity to do that because ever since I've started working on this project and telling people about it, I get so many different responses, but one that is very common is some version of, how dare you? How dare you tell me to look on the bright side? The world is on fire. Things are so awful in terms of, as you're saying, this election season bodes very poorly in terms of American morale and our ability to connect with one another. Climate change is really troubling. There's so many trends in our culture that seem just really tough. Mental illness is on the rise. It's just a really difficult time in the world. How dare you tell me to just look on the bright side? And to that, I would say, great point. I'm not telling you to just look on the bright side and ignore problems. And that's not what hope is. That's what optimism is, right? So optimism is the belief that things will turn out great. And I think that this is not a good time to be optimistic. There's this meme. I don't know if you've seen it. It's a cartoon of a dog in a room that's on fire, and the dog is holding a cup of coffee, and there's this word bubble that just says, "This is fine." That's that's what I think optimism feels like to a lot of people. It's a dog with a bowler hat drinking coffee in a room on fire saying this is fine. Hope is not that. Hope is not the belief that things will turn out well. Hope is the belief that things could be better. And I think that's a really important distinction because optimism inspires complacency. Hope is not complacent. Hope is an action-oriented feeling. It's not it's not the desire to ignore our problems. It's a response to those problems. It's saying, wow, things are really awful in these 19 different ways, but they could get better. And maybe I could help in making them get better, right? Maybe I could contribute to that improvement. So I'll just say one thing about it is that hope, for instance, is tied in research not just to individual well being. It's true that people who are hopeful feel better and tend to be healthier, but they also tend to contribute more to social movements. They tend to go to more protests and engage more in, for instance, behaviors to help social movements. Like if you're interested in preventing climate change. Hopeful people versus people who think climate change is inevitable are more likely to conserve energy and recycle and do things like that. So you can easily think of the hopeful person as complacent, but actually it's the opposite. Hopeful people tend to be more radical, more oriented towards trying to make change because they believe it's possible.
I love that. And I'll have to look for that meme of the dog on in the room on fire. Now, so kind of building on what you were just saying, hopeful skepticism, which we started talking about, what are some, and I think you just started to introduce this, but what are some ways that this can inspire positive change?
Yeah, so I'll go back to the two pillars that I was talking about earlier, and I'll add a third. The first is to think differently, and in particular, to be skeptical about our cynicism. It's important to understand that our minds are built to focus on the negative. Evolutionarily, that makes sense. You can avoid, it's safe to ignore a sunset, but not safe to ignore a tsunami, right? So we tend to focus on and pay a lot of attention to the worst things in our environment. Also, as we've been talking about, our media ecosystem feeds us those things. So it's normal to focus on the negative, but hopeful skepticism starts with understanding that we have that bias and challenging it, asking for evidence, asking, am I sure that this is the most accurate thing that I can believe? What other data could I have? The second is to act differently. We've talked about how to do that in the context of social shark attacks. Another way to do that is by experimenting with trust, trusting people even when we feel a little bit apprehensive about doing so. I'm not saying to hand your car keys to a stranger or give your bank information to a prince from another country who has a $15 million transfer they'd like to give you, right? I'm not talking about being gullible, but taking calculated risks on other people and seeing how that goes. Again, most of us are not trusting enough. Data shows that we're actually too apprehensive and we underestimate how trustworthy and kind others are. So give people a chance when you feel safe doing so. And again, pay attention like a scientist to what comes back. You might find that people are a lot better than you think. And then the third thing that I didn't share earlier is in addition to thinking differently and acting differently, we can share differently. We can be aware of our own power over others, right? We're not just receiving information, we're also giving other people information, and we create the social world that they live in. I think this is especially important if you're a leader in any context, whether it's a family or a team or a company or a town. I do this a lot with my own kids. I try to make sure that I balance the gossip that I'm providing to them, right? If I'm stuck in traffic driving them to school or camp, I might say something mean about somebody who cuts me off, right? That's me giving them negative data about people and humanity. So I also try really systematically, really intentionally to point out to them positive things that people are doing. And I think that that's my responsibility as a parent is to not just focus on teaching them about all the risks that are out there, but also teaching them about the goodness that's out there in the world.
I love that. That's such a great a way to look at it in terms of how you're what you're sharing and being conscious. Because oh man, I have nieces and nephews. The youngest is just turned a year old. The oldest is almost 16, I think. And it's just they're like sponges for information. It is wild. They are listening and watching. So I just have just a couple more questions I want to ask you, but just I feel like I would not be closing the loop if I didn't ask you. If someone is recognizing they have a tendency towards cynicism, that it's impacting their life, what are some shifts or little steps that someone can take to start moving towards the hopeful skepticism?
Yeah, again, I would say that a lot of the practices that I use are drawn from cognitive behavioral therapy. So one of those is what's known as hypothesis testing. So ask yourself, like, if you find that you're coming to a negative conclusion about somebody else, if you're suspicious of people, ask yourself, what evidence do I have to support this belief? And is there better evidence that I could try to gather? The second step would be to collect more social data, again, by taking calculated risks on people, by trusting people when you can, and by putting yourself out there in new ways, right? And it's important to do this in a way where you feel like you're not taking risks that put you in any danger, right? I mean, I think that cynics often have been hurt in the past, and I certainly don't want them to feel like they're putting themselves in harm's way again. But it's also important to remember that when we've been hurt in the past, it's easy to continue being hurt because we're not willing to take risks again. We basically are so focused on staying safe and not being betrayed once more that we deprive ourselves of all sorts of connections we could have made. So I think it's important to understand that balance, that sometimes in order to get past a betrayal, we need to be vulnerable again. And I think that that's an important step for people who find themselves being cynical is to understand that risks are the only way to grow past difficult experiences.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. So, Jamil, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I have loved this conversation. I can't wait to share it. If people want to connect with you, check out your book, learn more about your work, what's the best way for them to do so?
Thanks for having me. This has been a great conversation. I can be found online pretty easily. I have a lab at Stanford that people can look up, the Stanford Social Neuroscience Lab. My book, Hope for Cynics, is hopefully everywhere where you can get books. And yeah, those are the two places. I'm on social media as well. That's pretty easy to find.
Great. And we'll be sure to link to all that stuff in our show notes too. So, okay, I know I warned you about this, but I have one question I ask everybody who comes on this podcast. And I ask this question because there's just so many different ways to interpret it. And I understand that we're all evolving and that answer can change day to day. But today, at this moment in time, what does healthy living mean to you?
I love this question, and I thought a lot about it when you warned me about this. And I think that there's so many ways to answer it. I could talk about physical health, but as a psychologist, I suppose I want to focus on psychological health, and I want to go back to Sigmund Freud's definition of a good life. Freud said that health, mental health, is the ability to love and to work, and I see a lot of wisdom in that. I think that to me, healthy living means being able to connect with people who I love, in my case, my family and friends, and also with a broader community, my colleagues and my neighbors, my children's school community, feeling that sense of social fulfillment because we are, after all, fundamentally social creatures. So I think that's one pillar. And then when Freud said to love and to work, I think of work not just as clocking in and clocking out, but rather the ability to contribute to society and to social progress in a way that is meaningful, that that feels coordinated with my values. So for me, that's contributing to knowledge and sharing information that I hope can help people live their own healthy lives. So I think that those two pillars, being able to be in community and contribute to the world, are to me two of the biggest pieces of healthy living.
I love that, and this is why I love asking people this because I get all these incredible answers, like, every time, something I never would have thought of, so thank you for that.
Yeah, of course. This has been really fun. I really appreciate you having me on. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm so happy we could do this. And for all you guys who are out there listening on your devices, wherever you are, I don't know if maybe you're taking a walk or you're doing your dishes, or I like to clean while I listen to podcasts. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And if you like what you hear, please consider leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. They do matter and they help me continue to bring you great guests today, like today, Dr. Jamil Zaki. And as always, you guys, have a wonderful day and we'll talk soon. Thank you for listening to Drama Free Healthy Living with Jess Cording. We'll see you next time.